The man who walked into Webb's auto that Tuesday morning in the middle of June 2024 did not look like someone who remembered the smell of wet asphalt on a cold October night 10 years earlier. He wore a gray shirt with no logo on it, dark pants, clean boots, and he stood just inside the bay door with his hands loose at his sides, looking around the shop the way a person looks around a place they have heard described but never quite pictured. Curtis Webb was under the hood of a 2018 Chevy Silverado at the time, one arm down in the engine compartment. The other braced against the fender, and he had already decided, without looking up, that the man was probably lost, or checking whether they could squeeze in an oil change, or asking about the property on behalf of somebody else who would never set foot in a place like this. He had not yet decided anything else about him. Delia was at the front desk, which was really just a salvaged wooden counter wedged between a filing cabinet and a pegboard covered in key hooks. She looked up when the door opened and asked the man if she could help him. He said he was looking for the owner. She said her father was in the bay. He said he would wait, and he sat down in one of the two plastic chairs against the wall, and he waited in a way that was patient and quiet, not the way of a man with nothing on his mind, but the way of a man sitting very still with something large in it. Curtis came out wiping his hands on a gray rag, already putting together a polite version of whatever he was about to say about scheduling. And he looked at the man in the chair, and the man stood up and looked back at him. And for a moment, neither of them spoke. What Curtis did not know yet was that he was looking at someone who had not forgotten a single thing about the night they first met. What he did not know was that the man standing in his shop had been carrying a debt, in the oldest sense of that word, across an entire decade, and that the 60-day notice folded in the top drawer of Delia's filing cabinet had brought him here even though he had not known it would. That is where this story lands, in that moment of recognition that only one of them had arrived prepared for. To understand what it meant, you have to go back to the fall of 2013, to a broke college kid on the side of a wet road, and to the man who stopped when he did not have to. Brennan was 20 years old in October of 2013, a first-generation student at a state school 40 minutes from downtown Cincinnati, studying supply chain logistics on a partial scholarship and a string of part-time jobs that never quite added up to comfortable. He drove a 2001 Honda Civic that had belonged to his mother's sister, a car with 160,000 miles on it, and a front axle that had been making a sound Brennan had been telling himself for 2 months was probably fine. On the night of October 14th, the axle decided it was not fine. The Civic locked up and drifted to the curb on a 2-lane road running through the south side of Cincinnati at 10:30 in the evening, with rain coming sideways and Brennan's phone at 11% battery. He called his roommate, Ray Holloway, first because Ray was his first call for everything that year. Ray was also broke, also far from a tow truck, and entirely unable to help except to stay on the phone with Brennan and tell him every few minutes to hold tight. Brennan stood beside the car with his hood pulled over his head, watching the rain come down through the streetlight glow, and he was trying to calculate whether he could afford a tow and whatever a shop would charge for an axle on a car that old, and the number he kept arriving at was one he did not have. Curtis Webb's tow truck came around the corner 20 minutes later. He had not been dispatched. He had been coming home from a parts run to a warehouse on the east side, seen the hazards blinking in the rain, and pulled over out of the same reflex that made him check under the hood of a neighbor's car when he saw it sitting too long in the same spot. He got out in the rain without a jacket, assessed the Civic in about 30 seconds, told Brennan the axle was gone, and asked him where he needed the car to go. Brennan said he did not know he could not really afford a shop right now, and Curtis looked at him for a second, with the particular attention of a man measuring a situation precisely. He said, "Bring it to my place." Webb's Auto was 8 blocks south, a rented bay in a 2-story commercial building on a street that had once held a tire shop, a diner, and a laundromat, and had held on to the auto shop longer than the rest. Curtis ran it alone at that point with part-time help from a young guy named Marcus, who came in 3 days a week and knew enough to be useful. The shop smelled of oil and concrete dust and the particular warmth of a space heater working against a drafty garage door, and when Curtis pulled the Civic in and got it on the lift, Brennan sat on a metal stool near the back wall and watched and tried to figure out what to say. He asked how much it would cost. Curtis told him to hold on. He looked at the axle for a long time, then at the rest of the undercarriage, cataloging things with his eyes the way a person catalogs a situation they have already decided to handle. The axle was the immediate problem. The CV joint was worn through. The parts, Curtis said, would take a day to get in, and he would have the car ready the morning after next. Brennan asked again how much. Curtis said they would talk about it when it was done. He let Brennan sleep that night on the couch in the small office behind the bay. It was a couch covered in a sleeping bag that had clearly served this function before, beside a space heater and a stack of auto parts catalogs and a coffee maker that Curtis turned on at 5:30 the next morning. Brennan woke up to the smell of that coffee and the sound of a radio playing low in the bay, and Curtis was already there, already working, and did not make a production of any of it. Delia was 12 years old that fall, and she came to the shop after school on Wednesdays and Fridays, sitting at the wooden counter doing homework, while her father worked. She remembers Brennan as the college kid with the wet jacket, who was very polite and very quiet, and who helped her with a word search puzzle she was stuck on while her father was on a parts call. Brennan does not remember the word search puzzle. He remembers sitting at that counter watching Delia do homework and feeling for the first time in months like he was somewhere that had something solid about it. The car was ready the morning of October 16th. Curtis drove it around the block twice, came back, parked it in front of the bay, and handed Brennan the keys. Brennan asked what he owed. Curtis told him 0. Brennan stood there for a moment with the keys in his hand and said he couldn't do that. And Curtis looked at him with the patience of a man who had said things twice before and did not enjoy it, and said the job was done, and he needed the bay. The parts had cost Curtis $340 out of his own pocket. He charged Brennan nothing. Brennan called Ray from the car and told him what had happened, and Ray said, "That kind of thing does not happen anymore," and Brennan said evidently it does, and neither of them said anything for a minute because there was not much to add to it. If you have ever been 20 years old and broke and running low on reasons to believe anything would get better, you understand what that night meant to Brennan. Not in the dramatic sense, in the quiet sense. A stranger had looked at his situation and decided it was worth something without being asked and without expecting anything back. And that was a rarer thing than it should have been, and Brennan knew it even then. He tried to go back and pay Curtis. He went to the shop twice in the month after, and Curtis was either out or very busy, and the second time Brennan left an envelope with $40 in it at the counter, which was all he had at the time, and Delia took it inside, and Curtis mailed it back with a note that said he appreciated it, but no. Brennan kept the envelope. He kept it for a long time. The years that followed were long, and then suddenly not long at all. Brennan finished his degree in 2016 and went to work for a regional freight company outside Cincinnati, not in a prestigious role, not at a salary that impressed anyone, but in a role that put him close to the logistics operations he had studied and gave him a close view of where the inefficiencies were. He spent 4 years in that company, learning everything it was doing wrong and sketching, in a notebook he kept in his truck, the shape of what he would do differently. In 2020, he left and started a company called ClearPath Freight, out of a rented desk in a shared office space in northern Cincinnati. Ray joined him 6 months in as his operations coordinator, and the two of them worked at a pace that did not leave much room for anything else. Ray was the person who kept the memory of Curtis alive in Brennan's mind. Not in a sentimental way, in a practical, conversational way that meant the story stayed current, rather than becoming a story Brennan only told at dinner parties. Ray had a habit of referencing things that had shaped them, casually and without ceremony, the way people reference formative things when they are in the middle of building something new. He would say, when Brennan was agonizing over a vendor who owed them money, "Do you remember when that mechanic fixed your car and then mailed your $40 back?" And Brennan would say he remembered. And Ray would say, that is the kind of thing that either breaks you or calibrates you. And Brennan would not answer, but he would sit a little differently after. ClearPath Freight grew, not fast in the early years. The first year was a series of small contracts with regional retailers that kept the company solvent by a margin that occasionally thinned to alarming. The second year was better. The third year, they moved to a proper office and hired 12 people. By 2023, ClearPath had 41 employees, contracts with 3 national distributors, and was moving freight through 4 regional hubs, one of which was Cincinnati, the city where Brennan had started and where he had chosen to keep the company's main operations. He did not think about Curtis Webb every day. He thought about him with the irregular frequency of a person who had done something with a piece of shaping knowledge and had not yet found the right way to close the loop. He had gone looking online a few times over the years for Webb's auto, found a listing with a phone number, and had not called. He was not sure what he would say. He was not sure it was his place to walk back into someone's life and announce that he had been changed by an act that other person had probably forgotten. Curtis had not forgotten, but he had filed it under the category of things that were simply true about him, which meant it occupied no particular space in his memory. The decade had not been easy for Curtis in the way it had been for Brennan. The shop had held on, and that in itself was a form of stubbornness that deserved acknowledgement. The recession years had thinned the margins badly, and a road widening project on the street out front in 2019 had consumed half the parking for the better part of 8 months, routing customers to a different block and cutting his walk-in business by almost a third. He had made it through that stretch on relationship customers, people who had been coming to him for years and who would park 2 streets over and walk rather than go somewhere else. He had not asked for their loyalty. He had earned it by being the kind of shop that kept your old car on the road without overcharging you, and by being the kind of man who remembered your name and the history of your vehicle and gave you a straight answer about what needed to happen. But the building itself was not his. It had never been his. He had rented it from a property management company for 22 years, at rents that had climbed from $800 a month in the early years to $3,200 a month by late 2023. He had never owned the building because the capital had never lined up at the right time. And every time it had come close, something had happened. A repair expense, a thin month, a piece of equipment that needed replacing, and the moment had passed. In November of 2023, a letter arrived from the property management company. It was not the kind of letter that came with good news inside it. Curtis read it at the counter on a Tuesday afternoon with Delia watching his face. The lease would not be renewed. The property was under consideration for a different use. He had 60 days to vacate a building where he had worked for 22 years. Delia took the letter and read it herself, then set it down very carefully, which was the motion of a person deciding to be steady. She asked what they were going to do. Curtis said he did not know yet. He went back into the bay and worked on a Ford F-15. Oh, that needed a new serpentine belt, and did not speak about it again for 2 days. He looked at other spaces. There were 3 properties within a reasonable distance that could work as an auto shop with some modification, and the cheapest was running $3,800 a month. He ran the numbers carefully, which was a thing he was good at, in the way that people who have never had a cushion learn to be good at. And the numbers were possible, but not comfortable. And the idea of starting over in a new space at 61 years old, in a building where people did not know where to find him, was a kind of tiredness he did not fully admit to Delia. She saw it anyway. Delia had been watching her father carry things without saying so for her entire adult life, and she recognized the weight of this particular burden by the way he moved in the bay in the evenings. A little slower, a little more deliberate, checking work he had already checked. She had been running the front desk full-time for 6 years by then, and she had her own investment in the shop, her own reasons to want it to survive, but she did not push him. She trusted his pace. If you have been following this story from the start, you may be thinking right now about the man who sat in that plastic chair in June 2024 and waited. This is a good moment to say that if this kind of patience, across a decade, speaks to something in you, stay with it. Leave a comment telling us about a debt of the heart you've been carrying. These stories are worth saying out loud. Brennan's decision to expand the Cincinnati hub came in early 2024, driven by a new distribution contract with a national home goods retailer that would substantially increase the freight volume running through the city. He needed more operational space, a larger staging area, and ideally a building on the south side of the city that could serve as a secondary logistics point without requiring significant infrastructure investment. He told his real estate coordinator, a careful and organized woman named Patricia, to put together a list of commercial properties in that corridor. Patricia was thorough. She came back with 8 properties in varying states of availability and suitability, sorted by asking price and renovation estimate. The 5th property on her list was the building on the South Side Street that housed Webb's Auto. It was listed as a commercial building with ground-floor bay space and a second-floor storage unit, currently occupied by an auto repair business with a lease non-renewal pending, available for purchase at $420,000, negotiated in preliminary conversations to $410,000. The building sat on a lot that extended to an adjacent parcel the current property owner was willing to sell together. Patricia flagged it as a strong candidate for conversion to a logistics staging area. The bay space was already equipped for heavy work. The loading clearance was good. The lot next door would handle the vehicle volume. Brennan read through the packet on a Thursday evening at his desk. He paused at the address. He looked at it for a moment with the expression of a person placing something they cannot quite place yet. The South Side. He pulled up the listing and looked at the photo of the building's exterior. The sign above the bay door said, Webb's Auto. He sat with that for a while. He did not tell Patricia anything yet. He asked her to schedule a property walk for the following Tuesday. She asked if he wanted to bring the acquisition team, and he said no, just him. And she wrote it down without comment because she had worked for Brennan long enough to know that some things he needed to see for himself first. He did not call Ray that night either, though he thought about it. What he thought about, sitting alone at his desk with the listing open on his screen, was a man in the rain without a jacket, looking at a broken axle with patient attention. He thought about $340 spent without fanfare and $40 mailed back with a note. He thought about how the shape of a life can hinge on an hour in the middle of a night when someone decides to stop. He drove to the shop on Tuesday morning. He parked on the street and sat in the car for a moment before going in. The sign above the bay was the same, painted blue and white, faded now where it had been newer then, and the bay door was open, and the sound of a socket wrench turning in a bolt floated out into the warm June air. He went in and sat in one of the two plastic chairs. The chairs were the same plastic chairs. Delia came out from the back and looked at him and asked if she could help him. He said he was looking for the owner. She said her father was in the bay. He said he would wait. Curtis came out with the gray rag in his hands and looked at Brennan, and Brennan stood up and they looked at each other across the counter, and Brennan said his name, Brennan Stoneheart, and said that they had met a long time ago and that he was not sure if Curtis would remember. Curtis looked at him carefully. The face was not immediately familiar. 10 years and a version of that boy who had been wet and young and scared had become this man who was none of those things externally. And Curtis's memory was good, but not infallible. He said he was sorry. He met a lot of people. Could Brennan give him a little more? And Brennan said October 2013. A Honda Civic. A broken axle on the road in the rain. He said you towed the car and fixed it over 2 days and you wouldn't take any money for it. Curtis went still. Not dramatically still. The way a person goes still when a weight they have been carrying without knowing it is suddenly identified and named. He said slowly, "The kid from the road." Brennan said yes. Curtis looked at him for another second and then said something low and under his breath that Delia would later describe as not quite a word, more like the sound of something settling. He remembered the Civic. He remembered the rain. He remembered the couch in the office and the coffee maker at 5:30. He did not remember the face as well as he remembered the situation, because the face had been 20 years old and was now 30 years old. But the situation came back whole and complete, the way situations from certain nights do. Delia was watching from the doorway between the front desk and the bay. She had not yet put together who this was or why it mattered. She would. Brennan asked if they could sit down, and Curtis indicated the small office behind the bay with one hand, and they went in there, and Delia brought 2 coffees without being asked and set them down and stayed because Curtis did not tell her to go. Brennan told it plainly. He said he had been building a logistics company for 10 years, that it was headquartered in Cincinnati, and that he was expanding the South Side operations and needed commercial space. He said his real estate team had flagged this building. He said when he saw the name on the listing, he had come himself. Curtis listened. His face did not give much away while Brennan was talking, which was a thing about Curtis that was consistent across his whole life. He processed before he reacted, and the processing took place somewhere interior and unhurried. Brennan said he knew about the lease non-renewal. He said he had looked at the property documents and he understood Curtis had 60 days left. He said he wanted to buy the building. Curtis nodded slowly. He said he had figured it might be something like that. His voice was even, and he looked at his coffee cup rather than at Brennan, and the look was of a man choosing his response from several that had presented themselves, picking the dignified one. He said he appreciated Brennan coming in person, and he understood the property was on the market. And if the company needed it, he supposed that was just how things were. His voice had a quality of acceptance that had clearly been practiced. Brennan said he was going to buy the building and sign it to Curtis. The room went quiet. Delia set her cup down. Curtis looked up from his coffee and looked at Brennan, directly for the first time since they had sat down, and the look he gave him was the look of a man who has been in the trade long enough to recognize when someone is trying to give him something that feels like charity, and who has a firmly held position about that. He said he could not accept that. Brennan said he understood that was his first instinct and asked him to hear him out. He said the following, and he said it without drama. He said that the night his car broke down in October 2013, he had been 3 weeks from dropping out of school. Not because of grades, because of money. He said the part-time jobs were not covering what they needed to cover, and he had been doing the math for the previous month, and the math kept coming out the same way. And the night the axle went, he had been driving home from a shift that had paid him $64, and he had been thinking the whole drive about whether the next semester was possible. He said he had sat on Curtis's couch that night and woken up the next morning to the sound of someone who had gotten up at 5:30 to work on his car without making it anyone's problem. And something in that had recalibrated him in a way he had not fully been able to explain before, but had been carrying for 10 years. He said that was worth more than $410,000. He said he wanted to be honest about that. He was not buying the building to be generous. He was buying it because he had been waiting for 10 years to find a way to close an account that still sat open in the back of everything he had built. Delia had tears on her face by this point, which she was not making any effort to address. Curtis sat for a long time without speaking. He looked at his hands, which were the hands of a man who had done physical work for 40 years, and which showed it in every crease and callus. He looked at the coffee maker on the shelf, the same one he had bought 11 years earlier, and which had survived because he maintained things carefully. He looked at Brennan. He said he remembered mailing the $40 back. Brennan said he still had the envelope. That landed on Curtis in a way that moved across his face before he could stop it. And he looked away and pressed his mouth together for a moment, and then nodded. And the nod was the nod of a man accepting something, with his full dignity and tact, which was the only way Curtis Webb had ever accepted anything in his life. He did ask about the logistics concern, because he was precise about such things. He wanted to know whether Brennan's company actually needed the building, or whether this was arranged to look like a business transaction. Brennan told him the truth. He said his company had identified the building as a candidate for a staging facility, because the bay space and the lot were genuinely useful. He said he was going to buy it either way. He said what he did with it was the part that was still in front of him, and he had not put the building on the acquisition list for Curtis's sake, because he had not known whose shop it was until he saw the name on the listing. He said the fact that it was the same building was not something he had manufactured. Curtis said he understood. He asked about the gift tax, because he was the kind of man who did not take things he did not understand, and Brennan told him his attorney had looked at it, that gifts of real property in Ohio carried federal gift tax implications above the annual exclusion, and that Brennan intended to cover that cost as well. Curtis said that was a lot of money, and Brennan said he was aware of that. There was a pause, and then Curtis said, all right. The purchase closed in late August of 2024. The property management company had accepted $410,000 for the building and the adjacent lot. The closing documents were processed by Brennan's attorney, and the gift deed transferring the property to Curtis Webb was executed and recorded with the county. Brennan paid the associated gift tax the following spring without noting it to anyone. Ray was there the day Brennan came back to the shop to hand over the deed copy, because Ray had been present at the beginning, and it was right that he be present at this. He sat in one of the 2 plastic chairs and watched Curtis, Hold the paper with both hands and read it twice, slowly, the way you read something when you need to be sure of what it says. He had taken a day off from the ClearPath operations in Columbus to be there, driving up that morning and arriving before Brennan, drinking a cup of Delia's coffee and telling her, when she asked how he knew Brennan,